the Fridays that we would have an investment committee. Investment committee sometimes started as early as 6:30 in the morning.
Wow.
The reason why I would start that early is the first folks on the call were in Tokyo, right? And then it went from Tokyo to Hong Kong, Hong Kong to Mumbai, Mumbai to London, London to New York, New York to California. To edit, to keep it short and keep your listeners awake. But I'm the youngest of 5 kids. So my youngest brother, who's 8 years older, is 58. I'm 50 now. My oldest brother is 68. So I grew up in a family of adults. Yeah. So I didn't really have siblings that were chasing us around the yard. And my dad was retired military and was in the Defense Department. My mom had started her own business. So it was kind of like, hey, what are you doing? What's next? Let's go. You've got things to do. So that's sort of the world that I was in. And our family, dad's side was from the New York area. Yeah. Mom from the Midwest. So would grow up going up to the New York City metropolitan area, riding the train, going into town. And so I was really captivated by cities and the power of place and the dynamics of people from all over the world running into each other and creating great places, and also seeing what happens when it didn't work and when it wasn't necessarily well run. And anyone who went to New York City in the 80s can attest it was a scary place. But in growing up outside D.C., being able to ride the metro in, and as a kid, the freedom that a great urban place gave you when you had mobility, either on foot or transit, was really, it made the world seem really big and a world that I could be part of. So where that leads me is, I think I realized I wanted to be part of creating places. Right. And how do I do that? And I came pretty early to saying, hey, I think I want to be an architect. And it was interesting. So we ended up applying to like 12 different schools, even like the Naval Academy. And finally I had to call my dad. I'm like, Dad, naval architecture isn't buildings. So we dropped that one, even though I probably had no chance of getting in. So I wanted to be, I'm an architect. So when I was finishing even high school, I was able to get a summer internship at HOK in DC, which was an amazing opportunity, working in the mailroom and getting to see how that place works. And what hit me there, and it's interesting, it just triggered a memory with your question. What hit me there, there's probably 110 people that worked in that office. A lot of those were architects in terms of people who'd gone to architecture school, gotten a degree, and were hired by HOK. And this is an indictment on HOK or that office, but at the time, I think there were probably only 5 people in that office that really drove design. Everyone else was sort of supporting cast. And coming back to that upbringing that I had, I'm sort of a high-strung individual. Like, I got places to go. Like, and I saw this and I said, oh my gosh, I'm going to go to school for 4, maybe 6 years to then come to a firm like this, which is arguably one of the best, most globally known firms, and then grind it out for another 20 years to then maybe be one of the 5 who draw lines that really matter. And it became clear to me, it was like, wait a minute, I want to be the client. Right. I don't want to be the one producer. Yeah, exactly. Even though I greatly value that producer. So when I started my college work at Georgia Tech and a bachelor's of science in architecture, I immediately started getting minors, or at the time we called them certificates, in land development and real estate, because I knew I wanted to be a developer. Right. So I showed up as a freshman at Georgia Tech in Atlanta in 1992, knowing I wanted to be a developer, which is sort of not a great place for a freshman to start off with his, black beret wearing architecture, professors who want you to, think of crazy things. But it was great. And it taught me how to think. I'd argue that kind of curriculum is one of the best possible critical thinking educations. It's a really hard school. So we worked really hard and played hard. And so I just kind of went from there.
Yeah. So the city planning, did you always want to get a master's, or was that a byproduct of being in the program for 4 years?
So great question. It became clear to me, getting my undergraduate degree in architecture, even with minors in land development and real estate, that I wasn't going to be able to do that much with that degree, even from a great school like Georgia Tech. Like, I could go get a job at an architecture firm, but it would be right where I said to myself I didn't want to do and start grinding out for 20 years. So it became kind of clear to me that I need to kind of jump the shark and try to get in front of a real estate developer, someone to say, hey, come do this with me. And I looked into the curriculum at the School of City and Regional Planning, and it was basically real estate development. They had real estate law, they had macroeconomics, microeconomics, they had all these different components that were a perfect educational roadmap to get into real estate development. It wasn't called real estate development at the time. I think they actually do have a program now. It was just called Masters in City Planning or City and Regional Planning. And what I did is I was fortunate enough to kind of overload my undergraduate courses and start to finish kind of early. And so I started taking graduate courses early. And I had an idea that I lived in a neighborhood in Atlanta called Home Park. It was a steel town. Basically, it was a mill town. There was a steel mill next door. And this neighborhood was built to support the workers at the Atlantic Steel Mill. And during my undergraduate work and focusing on land development and real estate and knowing going to graduate school that I would need a master's thesis or some kind of bigger project to build around, I thought that site was ripe for redevelopment. Right. It was right at the pin corner coming into Midtown Atlanta. I had grown up in the D.C. area. Washington, D.C. and Atlanta were very similar, but in very dissimilar ways. So Atlanta at the time was growing by 110 acres a day were getting consumed for new development every single day. It was growing. And at that rate, a fellow at the Brookings Institute called that the fastest growing civilization in the history of humanity.
Wow.
So Atlanta loves superlatives, but I think even that one made them blush a little bit, like, oh, we're not so sure that's a good thing. And the amount of miles that folks in Atlanta were driving every day was 110 million miles, like a day. They were driving all over the place. So that was enough to go from the earth into the sun and start coming back. And so I had this idea, let's buy a steel mill and turn it into a place to live, work, and play. And I started working on that in 1995. And I used my graduate school.
So while you're in school?
Then. Yeah. Okay. Well, I knew I needed, I thought that if I could put together a redevelopment plan with a pro forma and do the research and put together, from my master's thesis, that maybe I could convince someone to hire me. Just get a job. Yeah. And so I used, as you should, I used my graduate school courses, curriculum, professors to add layers and layers and layers into this redevelopment plan. And I was able to come out with my document called Atlantic Station, a place to live, work, and play, and then sort of shop that around to developers. When it got me in the door, got to know them, started to make the world smaller. And one of them said, yeah, this is pretty good. Why don't we try it? That's the short version.
Okay. Who were the developers you shopped it to? Were they all past alumni of the school? How'd you meet the guys that you shopped your proposal to? So
that's a great question. That's one of the things that, if any of your listeners are students or recent students or past students, lean on your network, even the network you don't even think you have yet. So Georgia Tech, thankfully, in Atlanta is a bit of an institution. There's a long legacy of graduates who were in the real estate business. In fact, Tom Wolfe, the great author, wrote a book called A Man in Full, which is now a Netflix series. It just launched this year. And it's about real estate development in Atlanta with a Georgia Tech grad that goes on. I mean, it's a seminal book in real estate development, A Man in Full. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen the Netflix series, but someone just sent it to me yesterday saying you've got to watch it. So I was able to use some of those resources, just almost cold calling. And the cold call of a student to an alumni almost always gets a response, always gets a sure, come on over. Yeah. The same time in graduate school, Georgia Tech had a good program where they connected students with graduate research associate position. So it allowed you to work, and with the company that you worked with or organization you worked with would then help pay for your school. So I did that with the downtown kind of development authority, if you will, called Central Atlanta Progress. And this is before the Olympics.
Yep.
And another group within that was focused on assembling the land for the Centennial Olympic Park and then creating the first tax increment financing district in the state of Georgia around that to do something called value capture to then add improvements. So I got to be involved with that. And by the way that all worked was loaned executives. So there were loaned executives from Bell South, Georgia Power. And I'm a pretty precocious kid, even today at 50. Like, I'd love to switch places with you and ask you other questions. I love asking questions. I have a thirst for knowledge. I love learning. And so it was just a ripe environment for me to not only bounce my ideas off for Atlantic Station, who these guys and gals gave me some great feedback, but then they would also go, you should go talk to blank. And one of the people someone said I should go talk to was a guy named Charlie Brown. Literally the best name in the South, former Georgia Tech. He's a Georgia Tech grad, real estate developer. And that's who I went and talked to. And Charlie said, let's stay in touch. We should do this.
Yeah.
And sure enough, we did. That's the short version.
That's awesome. I think that's a great intro. So one, we didn't intro you yet. So Brian Leary, Chief Operating Officer of Highwoods, publicly traded office REIT. So we'll get to Highwoods in a little bit, but you have us here in this amazing building. So 150 Fayetteville. You have a view. I think Patricia toured me around the layout, so I got to see everything. But obviously, thanks for coming on the show. But we'll get to Highwoods in a little bit. Sure. But you've got a really cool career in digging into it. So we talked about Atlantic Station. We can talk about Crescent as well, but I want to talk about kind of do you want to talk about AIG or
Sure.
Okay, that seemed like an interesting period to be there. And then after that, the Beltline as well. So as you progress your story, what happens next? What leads you to furthering your career in real estate?
So first and foremost, I am so fortunate to be where I am today and have learned so much. There's a country song that says, God bless the broken road that led me straight to you. I joke with
Rascal Flatts.
Exactly. I joked with my wife about that. And there's been lots of
broken roads.
Yeah. But I learned so much through all that stuff. So fast forward, how do you pull off something like Atlantic Station to go from a master's thesis to something today that is home to thousands of people that live there, tens of thousands that work there, millions that visit there. You have to have the right capital partner. So I like to joke, there's no romancing without financing. So we had a great idea. We had a plan. We had a plan to clean this site up. Atlantic Steel Mill had been there for 100 years.
Yeah.
And with the environmental contamination at Brownfield, you need something called a PLL policy. It's an environmental insurance policy for pollution limited liability. Mm-hmm. And the largest underwriter of that policy at the time was AIG. And AIG is, prior to the global financial crisis, was one of two AAA bond rated companies in the entire United States. The other one was GE. AIG, interesting background on who they are. Many people hadn't even heard of them until the GFC, unless you were a Man United fan and you saw that AIG was on their jersey. Right. They were founded in Shanghai and then by Americans and then came over here. And so they're a global force, great company. And so when we talked to them about Atlantic Station to give us recommendations on who they think might be good capital partners because of their comfort and experience with brownfields and dealing with contaminated properties, well, they said, well, why not us? So we said, well, let's talk about it. So AIG became the capital partner in our LLC when we started Atlantic Station LLC. And Charlie Brown and I were working with a local developer in Atlanta named Jim Jacoby, who's a dear friend and a brother to me. Jim is, he makes it happen. He takes 2 and turns it into 5. And he's a bit of a hustler. And he had gotten this property under control but hadn't necessarily figured out how to unlock its true value. So Jim Jacoby, Charlie Brown, and I, with some great teammates and engineering partners and construction partners, were able to attract AIG's capital to then form an LLC to take the property down. And over time, it was 50-50 between Jacoby and AIG. And AIG started off with a $30 million investment, and some years into the future, they were sitting there with over a $300 million investment.
Into Atlantic Station.
And that's when they said, you know what? We should just own it all. And so they bought out the local partner, and that's when I joined AIG. AIG on the very last day of 1999. So basically closed the millennium with AIG, and we hope that, the next day the world will still be there, and it was. Yeah, so coming into a global company like AIG was pretty amazing. I had worked for companies of some size in the past, but they were a truly global force. I'll give you a little example. Just so people understand, insurance companies are in real estate because, now I'm not talking about policies they write, liability policies. I'm talking about their investors in real estate. Why? Because for every dollar they collect from premiums, they have to then put that money to work to generate a return to then be able to pay out claims. So they have to be putting their money to work to grow that money that their customers are giving them. So that way, when their customers file a claim and need it, they have more when they started. So if you think about that, if an insurance company is just an investor, when an investor needs a diverse portfolio, and so they invest in multiple things, well, real estate is a reasonable asset class to invest in. And then, so to give you an idea of the scale and scope, AIG had offices all over the world. So on the Fridays that we would have investment committee sometimes started as early as 6:30 in the morning.
Wow.
The reason why I would start that early is the first folks on the call were in Tokyo, right? And then it went from Tokyo to Hong Kong, Hong Kong to Mumbai, Mumbai to London, London to New York, New York to California.
Wow.
We just go through. So that was how it would work. And it was pretty amazing to hear these voices on the other line. And some folks were living way in the future, and some folks were kind of living 3 hours in the past. Mm-hmm. But so anyway, that was interesting. And the AIG real estate group had grown.
What did they focus on investing in? Just land development, full development projects,
everything. So again, you got to think about it. A diversified portfolio means you're going to be in, equities, which are stocks, bonds, infrastructure, commodities, currencies, real estate. So they had a diversified portfolio. Now they're going to invest in real estate. Now you diversify within real estate. Core, which is you buy a building that's full. Mm-hmm. Development, which is more risky, value add. Then they're going to say, okay, multifamily, office. I mean, it's
everything.
It's everything. And this real estate group really is a high performer within AIG. So we had a big book of business, but we were just one piece of AIG Global Investment Group. So the investment group was a group that invested the dollars on behalf of the insurance company. The insurance company is a huge company into itself. So that was what's pretty wild. But from a real estate standpoint, this team did exceptional work, grew year over year for 30 years, delivered great returns. And then overnight, the world changed. And not to get into the too big to fail, and that's a whole separate podcast, but when your AAA bond rating goes to AA, which is still pretty good, it flips dominoes in terms of different covenants and different facilities. And facilities, I mean debt and different things. Oh, and then if it goes from AA to single A, and then the whole world changed with the GFC and things that were happening at AIG that had nothing to do with real estate kind of brought everything to a halt.
Right.
And then like the day after that, AIG is telling the world, we're going to get out of everything that's not insurance. So basically, we're going to get out of real estate, we're going to get out of airplanes, we're going to get out of all this stuff. And so globally, and as fast as possible, because we need to generate money to pay these up for these other things. Mm-hmm. So if you think about real estate, you know this, and most of your listeners probably have a somewhat sophisticated view on real estate. Like real estate is a long-term kind of asset. It's very difficult to create value overnight in real estate. The upside is it's also very difficult to zero out value overnight in real estate, right? Yeah. You think about like Instagram or one of those like social media sites. I think Instagram has the photos with different filters that you take a picture and you can do different filters.
Right.
I'm going to get my facts wrong, but my story's right. So that was invented. Instagram was created by some Stanford students. Mm-hmm. And the name of those filters in Instagram, the name of those filters were the beers that were on tap in the Palo Alto pub that they were in when they came up with this idea.
Wow.
From the moment that they came up with the names of the filters in that Palo Alto pub to the day they sold to Facebook, I believe, mm-hmm. was 1 year. And they sold it for $1 billion. There's very little you and I can go from zero to hero in real estate for $1 billion like that. Now, at the same time, boats.com, pets.com went from $1 billion to zero. WeWork went from 20 to zero, right? So there you go. But back to real estate, AIG, we tell the whole world we're sellers into a lousy market too. Forget whatever's going on with AIG. And so, again, maybe my facts are wrong, but my story will be right. I'll give you an example. So I mentioned AIG was founded in Shanghai. It's called a reverse national corporation, came to the States. So it has very deep and broad relationships in Asia. And Japan was one of those. And AIG owned an office building. We owned an office building like on the Imperial Moat in Tokyo or something. Like there's very little foreign-owned real estate around that part of Tokyo, but for this one building. And we basically told the whole world, we're sellers. So that building, I think it was like 500,000 square feet, sold for $1 billion. Okay, so you can do the math on per square foot. And we were basically a fire seller into a horrible market, sold for $1 billion. It was resold a year later for $2 billion. So there it is. That's how you create $1 billion of value in real estate, is buy it cheap, I guess. So it was an amazing experience to go through, but also very painful because we had created, not just in Atlanta, Atlantic Station, but the whole company created great value, highly professional people with a legacy of success that was fundamentally getting the rug ripped out from underneath them. And they're still a real estate investor and developer, and more of an investor, not a developer today. And there's a whole diaspora of folks who are there who've gone elsewhere. But it was really interesting to see like something that I really thought would be 5 degrees separated come straight home and see that, stock price go from like $70 to 34 cents. It was painful. And then I didn't even know about something that could happen a year or so later when they did a 5-to-1 reverse split, which means if you had 5 shares, you then had 1 share. So like, I'm still underwater on AIG.
So when you were a part of AIG, were you mainly just involved with Atlantic Station, or did you become involved with everything? And then I guess the tertiary question is, were you involved in the sell-off of any assets when you were there? Yeah,
great question. So mostly Atlantic Station. Okay. Atlantic Station was a singular site, but multiple components are within it, office and retail and different things. In my role, though, as part of the team, I got some really cool exposure to the Seoul International Finance Center in Seoul, Korea, working on another project we looked at in northern Italy, and some other assets in Orlando that other folks in AIG were working on. But I had no direct responsibility for those. And yes, I was involved with, the Grim Reaper's here, time to sell your baby. You have to, stick around and help us sell it. So, which was kind of a weird place to be in selling something you poured your blood, sweat, and tears into a really lousy market, to know that when you're done, you shouldn't have a job. You probably won't have a job. Mm-hmm. So
that's crazy.
Yeah. So did that. And once that felt like the stars were aligning and it was going to happen, then I was very fortunate to do a complete different tour of duty during the depths of the GFC
leading the Atlanta Beltline, which is a whole nother thing in Atlanta.
Do you want to go over that? It's kind of very unique, and I think an experience that most people wouldn't in this kind of, if you look at your career, the other development jobs in Crescent and then here, right. And then you have this public-private partnership almost?
100%.
Okay. So can you give an overview of the Beltline? And then you were president and CEO at the time too. So kind of what you oversaw.
Sure. So first off, I would encourage anyone and everyone who is interested in the topic we're talking about, real estate development, investment, to go see the Atlanta Beltline if you haven't. It is arguably the most impactful, significant, comprehensive public-private partnership in the country.
Wow.
And it was a simple, brilliant idea by a classmate of mine, a great guy, a good friend named Ryan Gravel, Gravel, in Atlanta. And if you know the history of Atlanta is a city open for business, has been on day one. In fact, Atlanta only exists because of business. So a few hundred years ago, 18-something or other, the Atlantic and Western Railroad wanted to do its roundhouse and terminus station in North Georgia in a town called Decatur. Decatur's a great town. You should go check it out. Got a great little square, and MARTA runs underneath it, bars, restaurants, shops, really cool. But the folks of Decatur knew what came with the terminus station of a railroad. They knew at the time it would have been prostitution, gambling, drinking. They were not interested in that. They said, no, not in my backyard, no railroad. The railroad knew this is where they needed to be because this is where they could be far enough south and get kind of through the mountains to Chicago, but still close enough east to get to the Atlantic seaboard.
Yeah.
This is where they needed to be. So they went 8 miles to the west, drove a stake in the ground, and said, this will be our terminus, our terminal station.
Yeah.
Then what happened, I'm giving you, this is the history of Atlanta now, but then they needed a key contract with the state of Georgia. The governor of the time's daughter was named Martha, so they renamed Terminus to Marthasville. They got the contract, governor lost, and they're like, okay, don't need to do that anymore. And their marketing team said, you know what? Let's rename it after the feminine form of our own name, Atlantic and Western Railroad. We shall name this Atlanta. Wow. And that's how it became Atlanta. And so it was a rail terminal station, been open for business on day one. And what happened is, imagine just like on the roads, if you have congestion, they had congestion of all these trains trying to come from all over the Southeast and the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic seaboard to the terminus station in downtown. And each one of these was a separate company, right? So you've heard of different railroad companies. Mm-hmm. Well, that's how it was. It wasn't like the government built highways back then. They were private enterprises building railroads to all tie together. And there was so much congestion, 4 separate railroads built bypasses around the downtown congestion. These bypasses were belt lines.
Okay.
And these 4 separate railroads, actually, if you linked up these belt lines, would form a 22-mile loop around the city of Atlanta. And that was Ryan's brilliant idea, because these railroads in physical form still existed in some ways. Some cases they had 30 trains a day on them. Other cases they had been abandoned and the rails torn up, but you still had right-of-way, 70 to 200 feet wide. And by the way, railroads are typically flat.
Yeah.
So you have excuse me, They had flat land all the way around the city, but in the city limits, going through some of the most affluent and least affluent neighborhoods. It's a brilliant idea. He said, why don't we connect them? So anyway, I had the good fortune. The organization, which is a public-private partnership, had been around for 3 years. They'd gotten to a certain point. Here we are, the GFC. Anyone who's in real estate development, real estate investment, like the world's ending. And, I believe in divine intervention, what have you. And a headhunter called me about this job, and I went to coffee or lunch or whatever. And I said, look, here are some 5 names of people who'd be crazy enough to consider it. Because I was not looking to go to the quasi world of this big tar baby of a project that had been in the press and had politics all wrapped around it. And he said, no, we're here to talk about you. And after kind of convincing him that I wasn't the right person, turns out it was the right opportunity for me. And it gave me a chance to really lead. I had led teams, but to be the
the chief leader, and I learned so much: what to do, what not to do, how to build coalitions, how to get a stake in the ground.
What do you think was hardest to learn in that role? Like this being new, where it is very political, or maybe there is a lot of press, or there is this NIMBYism maybe around it too. Like, what do you think with this public-private as opposed to just being a private developer?
Yeah.
Do you think was hardest to learn?
Well, you've probably done your research. What the nuance that was what would have helped me going in. And it might have been naivete on my part, but technically the organization I led is a private organization that is contracted with the city and these partners to be the developer of the Beltline, to build this plan, this master plan. And so I kind of took what I had used in the private sector before Atlantic Station and said, like, I'm going to apply it to here. And that probably worked for 95%. But in hindsight, recognizing the public investment changed that private organization really into everything we did we should have had the thinking, I should have had the thinking as a leader of this is a public enterprise all along. And so that's what probably is the big lesson. We got $300 million worth of work done. We renegotiated contracts from $70 million to $10 million in the benefit of that. So we created tremendous value, got amazing things done. And I think the other thing that I learned too is that I am pretty high strung. I run hard. I work hard. I mean, I've been working, 60 plus hours for 30 years almost. And that's just how I am. And what the board gave me was some extra coaching with consultants and stuff, and I learned that, hey, like, to really lead, like, you have to have followers, right? I can't project whatever my own expectations are on myself onto a team and expect the same results. And so it really gave me a chance to better understand strengths and less strengths and to emphasize on different things. So it's just very interesting to understand, to be more self-aware about myself, but also have empathy. So I might have a leader who's very senior and been accomplished at what they do, but they will shut down if I ask them a question in a group setting that they aren't ready to be asked. Yeah. And I would have just thought, well, you're the pro. You should, come on, just run with it, or say, get back to us. And so unpackaging people and understanding how different people can be is in unlocking that superpower or to avoid some pitfalls. I definitely took that away, and I've definitely tried to apply that. The other thing I think in general, and this is a takeaway, is like the power of place, the exponential value creation of place that the Beltline has had on Atlanta. It's really hard. We're talking billions and billions of dollars. Wow. From the head of the Gwinnett Chamber. Gwinnett County is a big suburban county outside of Atlanta, very diverse, tons of people. When the CEO of the Gwinnett Chamber says, if I need to close a deal, I take them to the Beltline for Gwinnett.
Wow.
And so it's pretty cool.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So it's a really amazing enterprise. The folks who are leading it now are exceptional. I feel so proud of the work that we did and the seeds that we planted to see that fruit bearing now. But it's going through its growing pains. Now there's a big debate on whether or not transit should actually go on the Beltline, and maybe it's just fine as it is. And that's a really contentious conversation in Atlanta, and some folks I never would have thought would be on opposite sides have ended up on opposite sides. And in some ways it's actually healthy and natural that something evolves and it merits further conversation. That's one thing I'll give Atlanta credit is that they know how to talk about things. They know how to address issues. You know why? Because they had to do it around race.
Right.
That's a really hard one to do. They have practice. Yeah. Have they solved everything? Absolutely not. But they have a forum and some muscle memory for talking about these things, working through it, and ending up with a better result.
Wow. It's an interesting way to look at it. Yeah.
City shaping is messy business. And all that being said, there's very few new problems in cities. I'd argue there are no new problems in cities.
Historically.
Historically. You can go back 1,000 years if you want, but let's just take the last 100 years. So every morning at Highwoods, I'm so fortunate to wake up, if you will, doing business in Atlanta, in Charlotte, in Raleigh, in Richmond, in Dallas, and Nashville, and Tampa, and Orlando, all at the same time. Those cities, those regions are all in different ages of life. They're at different maturity levels.
No doubt.
And there's very few new problems.
Yeah. Interesting. Getting to Highwoods, do you want to bridge the gap of Crescent? It seems like a great company, and I'm sure you learned a ton there too, but I think that will bring us to maybe you maturing through office. I'm sure you already were at that point, but I'm sure Crescent played a pretty big role. So how'd you get over to Crescent, and then how'd you make the transition to Highwoods? And then we can unpack the REIT and what you guys are focused on today.
Perfect. So when I left, I knew when I was at the Atlanta Beltline, my goal was a tour of duty. And when I joined, I think the board was, they were very leery, pun intended, that I'd be a year and gone. Like a year, I'm there a year, the GFC's over, and I go back. I was there 3 years, and maybe I should have only been there 2 years, but 2.5 years. But 3 years, I went back to the private sector, and it's where I should be for a developer. And I actually partnered again with Jim Jacoby, and we partnered with a fantastic woman named Lisa France Kennedy, and she is the part owner of NASCAR. And we did a big mixed-use development with them in Daytona Beach, of all places. That's a whole nother story, but an amazing organization, amazing family, learned so much about that. And so while we were developing that, an opportunity opened up in Charlotte that a headhunter called about, who's become a good friend. And he said, "Hey, would you ever consider Charlotte?" And it was interesting at the time, I think we were due with our first, and my wife and I had been there for almost 25 years. At the time, my wife's the oldest in her family. I'm the youngest. My parents were in their 70s and 80s. Her parents are about a decade behind that. And the closest family we had was 7 hours away. So my wife's from the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. My family's up in the D.C. area. We're in Atlanta, about to have a baby, and we're 7 hours away from family. And I was kind of worn out with my tour of duty at the Beltline and all of that. And so we were open. Like, if anything came up between Atlanta and New York, we were open. And sure enough, a headhunter called and said, "Hey, there's this thing in Charlotte with Crescent." And I'd known Crescent. Crescent was well known as a brand, as a first-class developer. And he said, "Would you consider Charlotte?" And we said, "Absolutely." That put us 3 hours away from family. Charlotte is like Atlanta 40 years ago. It's a great opportunity and a place that's open for business. And I joined Crescent, joined Todd Mansfield's team. Todd recruited me there. Todd was the CEO. He was on the board, and the board asked him to come off the board and kind of get a Crescent in the right place. Todd's former life, he led Crossland Southeast, which is a big company out of Charlotte. He did amazing stuff. And Todd led real estate development for Disney at one point. So Todd's really among the folks who have had an impact on my life and set a model for culture and quality and excellence. He's right up there. So he was recruiting me for the opportunity to relaunch their commercial business. Crescent had been a prolific commercial builder, and it basically had a team of 30, 40 people, and was had basically contracted to about 3 or 4. And so the promise was, "Hey, we've got some good sites. You've got our support. Come in, relaunch, and come to Charlotte." And that's how I got to Charlotte and got to Crescent. And it was a fantastic tour.
What projects did you work on there that were important to you? So you were there 5-6 years?
Yeah. So I was there 5 years, and we had kind of nothing going on. And the first spec project that we got financed and kicked off was in Cool Springs, Franklin, Tennessee, south of Nashville. And so that was a big deal. It was our first one to get financed with third-party capital. So we had private equity and debt. Everything Crescent had done before was on balance sheet with Duke as their partner. And so that was the first time we had done that, small little 155,000 square foot office building. But then the big ones that were really city shaping were Ally Charlotte Center in Uptown, which is a 755,000 square foot office tower with a 381 room JW Marriott with, 25 to 30,000 square feet of retail at the street level. That's on the site of a former Arnold Palmer Cadillac right in Uptown. So that was a really big deal. It's a brownfield, shared parking garage. Super complicated, and we were able to create great value there. The other one of significance is something called the River District. And the River District is about 1,000 plus acres on Lake Wylie / the Catawba River, literally adjacent the western border with Charlotte Douglas International Airport, and right off the perimeter highway that encircles Charlotte. And so a tremendous opportunity to take that land and turn it into a inclusive mixed-use destination heavy on residential. So you could literally be on your stand-up paddleboard in the morning and make your meeting in 20 minutes in Uptown. So it's the River District. They've now extended the road, West Boulevard with a public-private partnership with the city of Charlotte. It's now open. Construction is underway. It's going to be a total game changer for Charlotte. Then, so those are some big projects, but one of my proudest ones is one right in the Elizabeth neighborhood of Charlotte, which is a super cool neighborhood. I would argue the number one amenity for office is the neighborhood. It's also the most expensive to change. And this neighborhood in Elizabeth already had a James Beard nominated chef. It had an awesome Starbucks. It was getting the Crunkleton, which is Gary Crunkleton's bar from Chapel Hill, was expanding to Charlotte, but adding a restaurant component. It had a Shomar's Diner. It had a Sunflower Bakery. It had all these things right at this intersection with great housing around, the Plaza Midwood area just off to the north, the east. You had Novant, major healthcare provider, Old Presbyterian Hospital, just, adjacent to it as well. And it had basically a vacant site that had been cleared for a failed project that couldn't get off the ground. And I saw great value there. And with the team that we had, we put together a deal with a landowner who contributed into the partnership. And now it is a really cool mixed-use office over shops and restaurants called Elizabeth and 7th. And so that's it's a cool architecture, Flatiron building with BBM architecture. And and then even relaunching the industrial business. So Crescent hadn't done industrial in forever. We relaunched that, and that's a big part of their business. But the thing I'm most proud of my time at Crescent is the people, the team that got built. There's a thriving team there doing great stuff, and it's really cool to see a very high quality company.
Yeah, that's awesome. One thing I want to go back to, this can transition us to Highwoods here too, but you said the number one amenity for office space is the neighborhood. I never thought of it like that.
It is because you think about
so being you're talking like just urban office space or suburban, like just anything, walkable restaurants? Are we talking housing as well? Just everything?
You named it. So it's all of the above. Okay. And you think about office used to be the place that you work, and you'd have to say, I have to go to work, right? Mm-hmm. It was like the job was there, you go to it. And so if you think about a 24-hour period, and you've heard the term live, work, and play, just go ahead and assign your 24-hour day across those three periods. So live, work, play. So live, all right, doctors tell you need to get 8 hours of sleep. Mm-hmm. Dolly Parton, Jane Fonda, Lily Tomlin told you work 9 to 5, so there's another 8 hours. So play, that means you have 8 hours of your own any day to really do something with. So maybe it's a few hours before you go to work, you wake up, and a few hours after. So if you think about where you choose to do the live, work, and play, right out of the gate, you can probably admit, all right, play, I go wherever I want. I'm going to go to the movie theater I want. I'm going to go to the bars and restaurants where I want. I'm going to go to the ball game, etc. Like, you have complete freedom over that. And while I think in the past many people think they have freedom over where they live, it's almost always a function of where they work. right?
Yeah, always.
Because it's about the commute. I need to be there. And so there's the kicker. Coming out of the pandemic, it's very clear to us that the workplace experience must be commute worthy. All right. So if you think about it, if I'm in New York City, the commute is very long, very expensive. My time costs more. It's longer, like just all of that. So my experience better be better than elsewhere. Here in the South, our commutes are not that bad. I mean, Atlanta notwithstanding. So the worthiness doesn't have to be as bad. So if you think about commute worthiness as an equation, A plus B equals commute worthiness. Well, the biggest factor is the commute. So all that being said is that everyone got enamored with work from home. By the way, after a while, you're no longer working from home. You're living at work, which probably doesn't sound as good. And so what we needed to do is give people the variety of things they need in their lives much more proximal to where they work. You need to be more seamless. So I'm 50, and when I started my career, and folks older than me, like where you lived is where you lived, where you worked. They were separated, and you typically drove between those locations. I think over the last 20 years, the whole concept of mixed use has made more sense. Kind of new build mixed use, which by the way is just copying cities and towns and villages for 1,000 years have always been mixed use and always worked, right? Because this concept of mobility can be expensive, right? Building train lines or roads or whatever. So the cheapest way to address mobility is put where you want to go and where you are closer to each other. So it's all these kind of Matthew, kind of duh when you look at but the neighborhood, right? Whatever that means. And I mean, that's basically within either a short walk or short drive or like that, whether that can support talent where it lives, works, and plays will make it all better. And so there's really good data out there that the premiums of multifamily and mixed use is 20%. The premiums for office and mixed use, 25%. I mean, and so, but it's not easy. It's not for the faint of heart.
Of course. So you transitioned to Highwoods, and to give an overview of Highwoods, you can kind of take that, but $6 billion-ish under management or enterprise value, publicly traded REIT, 27 or 28 million square feet of office space. Okay. So you have these 9 different markets. Before we kind of go over the REIT itself, what interested you most in coming to Highwoods? I listened to the earnings call and you said commute worthy experience, or maybe Ted did it. Through your last couple statements, I can tell your fondness of coming to work. Office space like this would entice someone to come to. But coming during 19, obviously you didn't know what was coming ahead, but what made you want to come to Highwoods? And then if you want to give an overview of Highwoods as well.
First off, Matthew, if it's not clear, I love what I do. I love what I do. I have for a very long time. So we were in Charlotte. We thought we'd be in Charlotte forever. We just finished a renovation on our house. We had this neighborhood. We could walk to the grocery store. We could walk. I mean, it was fantastic. Great friends. Thought we'd be in Charlotte forever. And then in developing Ally Charlotte Center and looking to capitalize that with a various different set of partners, I had the good fortune of meeting my now boss and CEO, but at the time COO of Highwoods, Ted Klink, and the CFO, a guy named Mark Mulhern, who's since retired, who's a dear friend. And I ended up telling them, no, sorry, really appreciate your interest. We're going to go a different direction. And they just asked, hey, can we just stay in touch? We enjoyed this. Let's stay in touch. And little did I know, Highwoods was soon about to undergo its own kind of leadership evolution with a longtime and transformative CEO retiring and Ted becoming CEO, and I'm looking to backfill the COO and someone to head up development and marketing. And they said, hey, would you consider Highwoods? And I'll be honest with you, I was a bit ignorant on the power of a public platform. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you a little story. When we were developing Atlantic Station, our original goal with Atlantic Station was to be the land developer and then to sell land to a multifamily developer, sell land to a single-family developer, to a retail developer, multi-developer. I'm not sure we even plan to do the office. Well, turns out when I told you AIG's investment went from 30 to 300 million, we ended up doing the retail ourselves. We ended up doing the office ourselves. And, but we ended up selling to multifamily and single family. So I'd kind of done the full gamut. And one of our potential multifamily partners in Atlantic Station that we were under contract with was a public company. And it became a new public company. So the person we had struck the deal with merged with another company, then it went public. And he lost control and ended up leaving that company. And I was naive and ignorant at the time of what actually happened there. But what I viewed from the outside was, here is a multi-year project in Atlantic Station that you need someone to make a commitment and understand what's over the horizon. Mm-hmm. And here is this, what I thought was the gold standard of multifamily companies headquartered in Atlanta. Boom, with this public, change, they now were dealing with analysts every quarter. They weren't necessarily delivering a penny here, a penny there. And so they started to lose traction. And boom, next thing you know, this guy was gone. I was like, wow, I don't want to be, that's not what I want to do. Because real estate is not a quarter by quarter kind of asset that you can create value with. Well, again, I was naive and ignorant at the time. So when Highwoods called, I was like, I hadn't really been looking to join a public company. But at the same time, I do seek out learning and growing. And I knew this would be a challenge and a new opportunity that I had never done before. The other thing, we were like, we're so happy in Charlotte. So my wife and I snuck over in a weekend, kind of rubber-nosed and mustached Raleigh to see, could we see ourselves living here? And sure enough, we could. It's such a great place for families, and the pulse of the universities here is so cool. Last night, we're a soccer family. We were at the ACC women's soccer semifinals here and saw Wake Forest and Florida State go to penalty kicks. We saw Duke and Carolina have an epic battle. I mean, there's something really special here with that pulse always going on. And then so I said yes and joined Ted and the team, and it's been so enlightening that actually if you kind of stick to your strategy, and yes, I've gotten used to going in front of the kind of the grilling and the examination among the analysts on our earnings calls, which is, I'm still not that, we all get wound up and we, cram for the week and make sure we think of every kind of question, because we really believe in our business. We really believe in what we're doing. And the worst thing you can do is get some random question that you can't answer confidently. And thankfully, as a team, I think we've kind of held serve. We always kind of go into these calls with the mantra, do no harm. That if you stick to your strategy, you actually have a much longer view of real estate than merchant builders. Merchant builders they get land, they fill it up, they flip it, they sell it, they rinse and repeat. Right. So, and the access to capital is kind of unmatched too. So it has been enlightening, and actually the place where I like to create value, I feel I'm fairly creative. It actually puts wind at my sails. And we started this transformation of our own portfolio and being commute worthy before this even term came up, before the pandemic. And, did we move fast enough? You never move fast enough. But we had already started this transformation as a portfolio and as an organization prior to the pandemic. And it's just added fuel to our fire that this is exactly what we need to be doing.
Wow. In your own words, what's the best overview of Highwoods and its portfolio? And then if you want to give an overview of your role as COO as well.
Well, first I'd say, Highwoods is a, publicly traded REIT on the New York Stock Exchange. And you can look up all kinds of stuff on us there. But I will tell you, we take our job seriously, but not ourselves. And that's Highwoods in a nutshell. Our big annual thing that Highwoods does is the cornhole tournament. Wow. We do a lot of other things too, the Heart of Highwoods and our diversity and inclusion group and all kinds of other really cool things that are emblematic of our culture, built around doing what's right, communicating early and often, and collaborating and being better together, and then kind of bouncing forward and being solutions oriented. So that's kind of who we are. And Highwoods, I have to give the team credit before I ever joined, and the leadership of Ed Fritsch and Ted Klink on this concept of that we want to own workplaces in something called a best business district. And for full confession, and I wasn't there when they came up with it, but I know that this is how they did it. During the GFC, the global financial crisis, Highwoods was a particularly suburban office REIT. And during the GFC, a great deal of the distress in particularly housing was in the suburbs. And this concept of being a suburban office owner was not great. And so Highwoods came up with this kind of coping mechanism, this term. So we're in BBDs. These are the best business districts. And so then we lean into that. These are in the best business districts that are both urban and suburban. And funny enough, what I love, we started to see this at Crescent from a residential standpoint, single family and multifamily. When I joined the team here at Highwoods, I was like, guys, let's lean into the suburban component because that's actually where most of America actually lives. Millennials that are out there, they are the largest home buying cohort or generation in this country. Largest. 81% of millennials, where are they buying? In the burbs. Mm-hmm. Oh, by the way, so now they're buying homes and now they want places to shop and places to work. And it's all this very cyclical. Again, back to there's very few new problems. These cities live in different lives. So Highwoods, we're focused on having the most commute-worthy workplace experiences that are the result of both environments, which is the built environment, the physical plant, and experiences, which is the software. So if you think about real estate, particularly office, having hardware and software, I'll date myself. I remember this is early 80s, late 70s. I wanted a boombox. My parents were older. They weren't that cool. They got me the boombox, but one, they got no batteries and they got no tapes. So I could play a tape. So I could plug it in to the wall, couldn't take it to the bed, and I could play the radio, but I had to wait for the record store to open to actually get a tape. The tape's the software. Let me give you the ultimate example of hardware software. When those two come together, you create great value. I'm sure someone who's listening has been to SoFi Stadium in LA. The newest, most expensive, shiny object of NFL sports stadiums or city sports stadiums there is. That's hardware. By the way, SoFi will give you a tour with nothing going on in it. They'll give you a tour for like $50. So $50 to do a tour of SoFi itself, nothing going on. Oh, by the way, you can do a VIP tour for $150. Again, nothing going on inside, $50 to $150, just a value created from the hardware with no software being played. Let me tell you what the ultimate software is. It's the Eras Tour by Taylor Swift being played in SoFi. Right. Tickets there, $500 to $1,500. Okay? You know what the kicker is? Taylor makes way less money on her software alone on her iTunes song downloads. She creates the greatest amount of wealth when her software is played in the live hardware. Right. When you can do that in office, in multifamily, in retail, you're going to create great value. You're going to win.
That's brilliant.
So that's our simple thinking.
Wow. So your team, I want to talk about a couple different maybe time periods. We don't have to talk about individual transactions, but we can if we want. But so your team has management, you acquire, you also develop in the REIT, and then there's been some dispositions. One thing I wanted, what is the investment philosophy? What exact is there? I don't know if you can talk about exact metrics or performance, but in making acquisitions. So we had COVID in 2020, which most people wouldn't think is would create a bullish office market, but you made maybe 5 or 6 acquisitions in 21, and then you did one in 22 as well in Dallas. What led to those acquisitions and to a unique time period to make those? Or maybe the basis came down and it was a good time to buy.
Yeah, so there's 2 real big ones during that period from a Highwoods standpoint. But let me take a step back.
Yeah, please.
Our job is to attract capital and then deliver a return to that capital. Mm-hmm. And if we can do that in a competitive way, we will attract more capital and be able to deliver more return. And what's interesting about real estate investment, again, like I learned two things when I was in grad school about real estate as an investment. First off, it's indestructible. Okay. So yes, a building can be destroyed, but you'll have insurance and can build it back up, but the land is there. Now, one could argue the land can fall into the ocean, but in generally, real estate is indestructible. The other thing, it's wholly unique. If I own this acre, you can't own this acre. Mm-hmm. You can own one next to me, but that is not the same.
Right.
So if you think about us, and I'm going to, again, I didn't check the exact numbers. I should have them in my head, but it's a little bit of PTSD after earnings call. If you think about us as an investment, if you think about what our stock price is, you multiply our stock price by our total outstanding shares, and you think about that's what you could buy all of our real estate for, right? It's a pretty good deal. And the kicker is when you invest in us, right, you're not investing, and I want to fire on WeWork, but when WeWork's value ran up, right, they didn't own anything.
Right.
They did own the liability via leases to pay rent all over the world with the belief that someone would come in generally on a short-term basis and pay them more than their long-term commitment. Well, we all know how that kind of worked out, right? With us, if you invest in us, we actually own physical assets. We own millions of square feet, 27 to 28 million square feet of real estate. Oh, okay, by the way, not only do we actually own physical assets, there's people in those physical assets that are under contracts, legal contracts to pay us rent, to pay us income. So think about what other businesses are out there. And by the way, on average, it's 6 years of rent. So the weighted average lease term of our portfolio, say it's 6 years. When you buy a share in a company like us, you know that not only are you getting a physical asset, that physical asset that share is backed by thousands of companies' obligation to pay. So I think we're undervalued. I always do. It's a great time to buy Highwoods stock, right, or any of the folks that we work with. So all that being said, we have a strategy. We believe that if we create exceptional commute-worthy experiences within the buildings we own, it will allow our customers, we call tenants customers, it will allow our customers to recruit, retain, and return the very best to their offices and their workspaces. If they do that, great value will be created by our customers. When great value is created by our customers, great value is created for us and our shareholders. That's our simple belief. If we do that, we will outperform, and we're outperforming our submarkets. We're outperforming our markets in terms of occupancy and rate and things like that. And that'll allow us to pay our dividend, that'll allow us to grow our business. And it's a simple, kind of mantra. We are not going to be tech stocks and generate these huge returns. It takes longer. It's more capital intensive. But that's who we are. All right, now back to your question on two big transactions through the pandemic.
Right.
So they are completely different. One was an opportunity to rotate and evolve our portfolio from slow growth markets to higher growth markets. So here we sat with our headquarters in Raleigh and no presence in Charlotte. Literally the biggest city in our home state, just down the interstate, thriving. So that was a kind of a hole that we needed to fill from a strategic standpoint. At the same time, we had assets in Winston-Salem, Greensboro, Memphis that are slower growth, but were high quality assets in those markets. Some were industrial. It's not core to our workplace making kind of goals. So it created a great opportunity to exit. And with that exit at scale and efficiency, it gave us the wind at our sails to go into Charlotte through the acquisition of the Bank of America Tower in Charlotte, which I was 1,000% support of because, hey, that's where I just came from. Yeah. And by the way, I'd just been competing against that building across the street at Ally Charlotte Center. So to me, it was just perfect timing to be part of that. And so that really happened like the fall of 2019 into 20, right? So who knew 6 months on the job, the whole world would come crashing down around us. Mm-hmm. And then what the next major transaction happened was with a company called Preferred Apartment Communities, PAC, who had a subsidiary kind of within them called Preferred Office, where they had launched a plan to kind of grow the office business. And the way that the markets had changed globally created an opportunity for PAC as an apartment community to maybe transact in a bigger way. They ended up doing it with Blackstone, but they needed to get simpler and cleaner and like more pure play multifamily to drive a low cap rate from the enterprise side. So they were an opportunistic seller out of office. We were that opportunistic buyer, and the footprints overlap very well. So that was one where we could lean in, move quickly. That deal was basically consummated via handshake.
Wow.
Up until the day of closing because of the moving parts on pulling that off.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
And what was the priority in getting out of, I think, maybe Memphis and St. Louis? There's
St. Louis in the past. I mean, we were in a lot of different markets, and funny, my mom's side's from St. Louis, so it's tough, but like it's a slow to no growth market. Mm-hmm. Memphis, slow to no growth. Greensboro, Winston, slow growth. And we've rotated out of those into Charlotte, rotated out and into Dallas. And it's a game changer. There's really no comparison.
Absolutely. One thing I was thinking about in my prep, so as competitive as office is right now, because you're competing against, are you going to be a vacant building or are you going to be occupied? There's a lot of people that paid a lot of money for some really great buildings that aren't really occupied. So what drives a lot of that, I would assume, is not only the amenity being the location, but the interior, right? So I read or maybe listened in earnings or somewhere, one of the investor documents about reinvestment into the property. So how do you guys evaluate when a building is ready? You own a great building, when it's ready to kind of rebrand from maybe that 2008-ish theme or 2009 or whatever it may be.
Or in case of the building we're in, mid-90s.
Mid-90s. So how does that get brought, how do you guys evaluate those as reinvestment, and how do you look at like kind of your yield on, it's kind of almost like a value add play to your own building.
Well, you nailed it. You summed it up in one sentence, right? So great question. Matthew, great question. So buildings are very hard to move, right? So like, again, that concept of location is fundamental about the neighborhood.
Right.
Okay. So buildings are very hard to move. So if you're in the wrong spot and think that you can add water and somehow change your fate, I'm not so sure. And that doesn't mean that everything has to be in a dense, thriving, mixed-use district. That does not have to be the case. Mm-hmm. Some of our most occupied buildings through the pandemic are surface park, suburban, because the commute worthiness does not have to be so exceptional because the commute is so easy, right? The other thing is not everyone can or wants to afford the most expensive rates of all of them. But coming back to your question, how do you determine this? So I'm gonna bounce around a little bit and let's see if we can follow it. And when you look at a building and you look at repositioning it or renovating it or redeveloping it, which we call highwoodizing, you need to look at buying that building all over again. So you think about its value, it's your basis. Yeah. Your basis can be what you have it on the books and your debt. We're very low levered. We have very few instances of secured debt. So we're in a very advantageous place. That's a credit to the team for years who's been maintaining the balance sheet as a fortress level balance sheet. So you have to look at, okay, I want to rebuy this building. What do I have to put into it? This stuff's expensive, right? Office CapEx is expensive. I actually have a graph. And so this is I'm going to try to paint a picture for your listeners. I want you to picture an XY graph. And I want you to think of the kind of y-axis is dollars and the x-axis is kind of scope of what you do, right? So what you need to do when you look at repositioning a building is you have to change hearts and minds.
Right.
If you don't change hearts and minds, I want you to think of a rocket, okay? So a rocket, the whole purpose of a rocket, you fill it full of rocket fuel, it must launch and escape Earth's gravity. If it does not escape Earth's gravity, what does it do? It comes back down to Earth. Rockets don't coast very well. And unless you have an Elon Musk rocket that can get caught by chopsticks and out of thin air, right, it usually crashes and burns.
Of course.
Escaping Earth's gravity is changing hearts and minds. Now, you can also overshoot and lose your orbit. So you can overspend. So what happens, you can total a building.
Right.
I mean, so you come up with all these crazy ideas and now you actually can't afford to rebuy that building. A lot of people don't run that analysis. They just do it and they're like, we're going to make it happen. And they overspend or they build the wrong thing. Or similarly, the worst thing, you underdo it.
Mm-hmm.
So there are buildings we've bought where the previous owner had attempted to reposition it, maybe missed the mark, maybe didn't follow through all the way that it needed to, came up short, and people didn't believe it was any different.
Right.
We are so proud of the work the team has done here at 150 Fayetteville on the state of North Carolina's Main Street, Fayetteville Street. This building has plenty of age on it, but I would argue today it has been rebirthed with a new birth date here in the 2024 era because the building's bones are so strong. It's got beautiful granite on the outside. The window line's great. And what have we done? We've taken a whole floor and turned it into co-working ourselves called The Commons. We've just opened our first restaurant that we're partners with LM Restaurants, who operates restaurants all through the South into Florida. We're opening, expanding fitness. We're doing all kinds of things to truly elevate the experience in this building. And look at our space here that you're in. What we wanted to do with our own space is that if you were blindfolded on an office tour and if you were brought up to this floor, took the blindfold off, that you would not know what age building you're in. You would think you might be in a brand new building. And I think we pulled it off as you kind of look around.
So. Yeah.
But we didn't spend a fortune either. So we try to be really thoughtful about where we invest, and with the idea that once we spend this money, we're still at this really advantageous basis to compete for rate. We're undertaking a repositioning of our Symphony Place Tower in downtown Nashville, and we looked at the model that we're going to spend there. If we were building that building from its bones today, it'd look exactly the same. It'd have this beautiful curtain wall. It's got this soaring lantern on top, this great lobby, plentiful parking. We need to add the amenities we're talking about. So we're going to take the entire 7th floor, which has a huge rooftop, and turn it into its own private club. And by the way, the qualification for membership is Highwoods membership. If you're a Highwoods customer, you now have a membership to this club we're calling the Cumberland Club. And it'll have spa-level fitness with a plunge pool and infrared saunas and yoga classes. It's going to have a whole customer lounge with a Topgolf swing suite and games and a bar. It's going to have a huge conferencing center with 155-person capacity that spills out onto a green roof at a pickleball court and a basketball court. By the way, this is all in downtown Nashville. And we can spend this money, which is not insignificant, on this tower on top of where we're at right now and have still such a significant competitive basis that we could conceivably, if we won, undercut competitive new rents by $10 a foot. So that's how we run the math. We run it kind of two ways. We can run it on what do you need to do to change hearts and minds and know that that is finite, run that cost and see if we can afford it. The other is you can run it with straight from the income model. You ask your team, if you had changed hearts and minds, forget what the scope is, what could you charge? What would the new rents be? What would your lease up schedule be? Then we can reverse engineer that through our model, and it says you can afford to spend $1 or $10 million. And then we decide, all right, I can afford to spend $1, can't do much. So we should probably sell that building. So that's kind of the analysis we're always going through.
Yeah, that makes sense. What triggers the renovation of a specific property? Is it analysis over time and, hey, this is lagging behind on where we want leases? Is it not leasing up? Because you have to blend doing a renovation, and then obviously it's probably a vacant level or floor.
Yeah, you nailed it. So these are great questions. So let me tell you what drives that thinking and drives it quickly is vacancy, right? So fully leased building with term, it's really hard to try to reposition, spend a bunch of money on that, because when you have opportunities elsewhere. That being said, we're not neglecting them. Usually if it is full, it's probably already in better shape than maybe another spot. Or we focus on the software side versus the hardware. Or if we know a customer or a set of customers are rolling, we can get ahead of it. We can say, hey, guys, what could we do to really elevate your experience here? Give us some feedback. Hey, if we do it now, would you extend early? We have a captured audience. We have a captured audience of 28 million square feet. That gives us a tremendous opportunity of a captured market to extend that relationship through further investment. And it's worked out.
Development versus acquisition. At the end of the day, your obviously goal is to drive investor returns and own office space, whether you get there via development or acquisition. Own office space that kind of ages well and is occupied, right? Commute-worthy experience. Yep. What percentage of the portfolio, how do you kind of split between development and acquisition? Development, especially inside a REIT, I would assume is kind of maybe not challenge. Maybe it is challenging, but it's kind of tricky, right? Because you're supposed to be developing a return, and you have
in the past, some of our best returns are via development.
Wow, they
really are, because that's where you think about the merchant developers who fill up their buildings and flip them and sell them and generate the 2x multiples and 20% IRRs plus. But
there's a period of non-cash flow for. Right.
Yeah.
Except development fees. So how do you guys balance development versus acquisition in the REIT?
Yeah. No. So it's a dial we can turn, right? So we have been historic developers. We've developed, a few billion dollars of development over the last 20 years, and we'll continue to be a developer. In fact, we're developing right now. This pipeline that we're in right now is the largest pipeline we've had in our history. It's finishing up. We delivered last year a new building in Atlanta, a new one here in Raleigh, one in Dallas. Coming up, we'll be delivering next year a building in Tampa, another building in Dallas through partners. So now, are we looking to start anything last year or this year? No, because it wouldn't pencil. And it wouldn't necessarily. We could make it pencil for us, but no one's going to pay the rent.
Sure.
That the interest rates or the stock price or whatever. So we constantly are looking at generating those returns. To your point, so we right now, if you look at where our stock price is and where the market is, and the discount to replacement costs, we're more focused on buying, more acquisitions, and that's actually the beauty of a REIT for us is we can go to where the market is and be a participant,
right?
No matter what the cycle is. So it actually works out really well. And when we do develop, we develop on balance sheet. Typically, we do not develop with a construction loan, which also gives us flexibility. Yep.
Yeah. What do you think the future, it kind of slowly in a way wrapping up, how do you think office will continue to evolve? We had this massive kind of shakeup via COVID.
Yep.
You guys being, an office fund, how do you think office continues to evolve?
So again, I'm going to try to paint a visual picture for your listeners. Going back to my XY graph, and this really comes out of a joke. About 6 months ago, we were feeling pretty sorry for ourselves on a Friday afternoon, not like you and I are sitting here today. Right. And the stock price was down, and there's one more article about work from home, and it was probably longer than 6 months at this point because there's been a lot more about return to work than there is work from home at this point. And we joked that let's go home this weekend and figure out how to swap out our almost 30 million square feet of office for 30 million square feet of multifamily industrial because that's clearly more fun. And we all showed back up on Monday, and no one had an idea. And we said, you know what? We're committed. We believe in our strategy. And this is the picture I want you to think about in your mind's eye. Again, simple XY graph. On the X-axis, I want you to think about the various real estate product types. Okay, I'm gonna lay them out in a second. On the Y factor, that's magic. Okay, I want you to think about magic that occurs in real estate. All right, back to X. Starting, and I want you to plot a curve that's a perfect 45-degree curve from 0, 0 up to the right-hand corner. Okay, 0, 0 in the corner. No offense, I'm sure some folks listening here in this business. I want that property type to be surface park storage. Okay, a surface park storage is a gravel or paved parking lot with a chain link fence and razor wire on the top. It's where you park your extra car, your Winnebago, your boat, what have you. Mm-hmm. It's a product type. People are making money on it. They're actually doing pretty good. But think about the magic that can happen in a place like that. And I'm not saying someone sneaks into a Winnebago and gets at it. I'm saying like the level of quality and experience that can happen in that, it's fairly low.
Well, they're leaving the site as soon as they park. So,
right, so that's it, right? So I want to go to the far end, the far right of this graph, the highest level of magic. And I mean, again, magic that can ripple from that space, that real estate product type, and change the world.
What is that top corner? Las Vegas?
No, it's life science. And we're not really in life science that much, but think about it. Life science, they came up with a vaccine for a global pandemic, like arguably overnight. They're coming up with cures for cancer. They're helping the blind see, the lame walk, the deaf hear. I mean, it's amazing. Oh, by the way, do you know what the term of that place where in life science where that's happening? It's actually called a workplace. So I would argue right next to life science is workplace or office. Because without the best and brightest coming together around a table, in a room, beanbags, whatever, not necessarily 40 hours a week, not necessarily Monday through Friday exactly, but it's people coming together, creating things, solving problems. Like that is where they're better together. Now you want to juice that productivity and that ability to make magic from a workplace standpoint, you then put retail, and then multifamily. I would argue that if you can stimulate talent at the start with coffee, nourish it at noon with lunch, and hydrate it at happy hour with some alcohol, it's going to do great things. It's going to come back. And so that's what I would argue is that, you know what, after really looking into it, I couldn't be more excited about being in the workplace business because I think the places we create and the experience we provide will allow great things to happen that might change the world. And if that's the case, real estate's a very small component of cost. You may have heard me say before that, you know, most companies spend of their typical expenses or G&A 1% on utilities. They spend 9% a year on real estate. They spend 90% on people. So you can turn the screws on your 9% of your office costs. And if you kind of diminish the ability of your 90% because you've got people on top of each other, it's lousy office space or whatever, you're in trouble. But if you can create a workplace experience that allows your 90% to be 10% more productive, happier, less recidivism, I mean, sick days, things like that, more engaged. By the way, if you get 10% more out of your 90%, your real estate's free. Wow. So, you know what? I kind of like what I'm doing. I love the people I'm with. We hired our first director of customer experience last year. She's one of my spirit animals here. She's been a great addition. So now we're looking at moving from a portfolio of sort of building management, which is sort of like a fleet, right? And the ultimate fleet manager is the Navy. So think about moving from the Navy to like the Love Boat. That's the transition we're in as a business and as a company. And I'm loving it. It's a lot of work to do because it's things that people aren't used to doing, but I'm seeing it happen since we've come to downtown Raleigh and we have recruited just on this one block alone, 6 new restaurants and we're doing it elsewhere. We're seeing an actual neighborhood transform. And by the way, that neighborhood is downtown. By the way, downtown's the heart of the state's capital city. Wow, that's pretty cool. We've just made a difference.
Yeah. Wow. In wrapping up on Highwoods, and I want to, we can kind of close with if there's any deal story, if there's anything about Highwoods we missed, I want you to kind of mention that. But a couple closing questions coming up. But if there is a deal story, we can chat about it. I know we talked about a bunch already, but how is the team right now in looking through recent earnings or investor decks? It seems like significantly outperformed other office buildings. How are you excelling in this market amidst interest rates, amidst insurance that's kind of gone rampant? So 2 questions. How have you guys excelled? And 2, what are some of the biggest challenges in your space or for you guys right now?
Well, I'd say the first reason why we've been able to excel in the face of such headwinds, and look, we're still, from a stock price below where we were right before the pandemic and all of that. But it is really kind of a comparative. How are we comparing against the market, against the competition? Right. Tell you, other organizations talk about their trophy towers, their trophy assets, and that matters. Our trophy assets are people, and I love my teammates.
Internal or tenants?
No, I'm talking about internal. Like literally, our people who come to work every day, who care about what they do, is really a differentiating factor. I have to give credit to leadership before and now. Our CFO is one of the smartest guys I've ever met, and he's constantly creating value. The work that we did as an organization with regard to the balance sheet before the pandemic, through the pandemic, has left us stronger, has put us in a position to think about growth coming out of this, as opposed to having to stay inside our shell and hope to survive. We have proven more than resilient. And I think doing the work, getting ahead of this a little bit, rotating out of Memphis and Greensboro and Winston. I love those places to visit. There's tremendous stories there. There's friends, there's culture. But from an office standpoint, I'm glad we're not trying to compete there right now. It would be much tougher. And so some of those things that we did before and leaning into the pandemic has served us really well and put us in a position, I think, to succeed going forward. Super competitive. It's a tenant's market or a customer's market still. But it's becoming more competitive for us because you're commenting earlier, there's a bifurcation in quality that's occurring of a flight to quality, flight to capital. And there's many buildings that just don't have the ability to invest, to reposition. Some are in the wrong location. One would argue we're 1 billion square feet under demolished of office in this country. So that'll take a lot of time to get out of the system. We're not all that different than the retail world was 20 years ago. And there were 1,000 malls 20 years ago in the United States. And some smart people then said, we're over-malled. And you've seen the evolution at 333 of those, a third are fortress, unmistakable, will be here forever. 333 at the bottom are already dead or gone. And the middle, the murky middle, we'll see. Yeah. Some will move up and some will move down. I would say the same for office.
Interesting. Kind of wrapping up on Highwoods, is there anything we missed about the company as a whole that you wanted to hit on there?
I don't think so. I would only say, and hopefully this doesn't come across as a forward-looking statement, the future is bright. We provided guidance for year-end, but I would say we believe in our strategy. We believe in our business. We believe that we will create great value for our customers and the environments and experiences we create and curate. If we do that, we'll generate outsized occupancy and returns for them and for us. And that's what we're going to keep doing. We're just going to try to be great allocators of capital, be efficient, and work our tail off because we feel like there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And we're pretty sure at this point it's not the train.
There you go. Is there any deal story that we missed along the way in your career? Can be anything, or we've talked about so many. I just want to give you a spot if you did want to touch on anything else that was significant in your life as a deal maker, as a developer, as a man who's worked in many different sectors.
it feels like so many are significant. And people are like, oh, you've been involved with so many big things. I'm like, man, you know how difficult and painful the big ones are? I'd like some easier ones. I mean, it goes everything from Atlantic Station. I mean, we could do 2 hours on Atlantic Station alone. Ended up having to partner with the EPA to do what we needed to do in Atlantic Station, not even on the brownfield, but we had to build a bridge over 21 lanes of Interstate 75 and 85 that combine in Atlanta form something called the Downtown Connector, which in reality, from an east-west standpoint, had served for 50 years as the Downtown Disconnector. So we had to build a bridge over the interstate. It ended up being a 135-foot wide bridge that could carry cars and transit, first of those in the state of Georgia. But the problem was that the EPA shut Atlanta down because of its poor air quality, which was tied to traffic, which would also take out our bridge. So ended up having to partner with EPA to figure this out. And I ended up having to put a spreadsheet together. Went to over 1,500 meetings over a few years. And I mean, you just plot that out on a calendar. I mean, that's many times 2 or 3 meetings a night. Environmental Defense Fund, Sierra Club, neighborhoods, oh my gosh, Seeing Eye Dog Coalition, whatever, just to build momentum around stuff like that. So, yeah, it's a great question. Learn so many things every time. This is one thing to take away. It's a small world in this business, and you could apply it to any business, I guess, but don't be a jerk. Don't burn bridges, because you never know where someone else is going to show back up. I remember there was a leasing broker at Atlantic Station who represented Rack Room Shoes. And Jim Jacoby had done a number of Rack Room Shoes out in the burbs associated with Walmart developments. And here we were building Atlantic Station. And we didn't really have a place for Rack Room Shoes. We wanted to shoot a little higher. And it could have been easy to dismiss that broker, like, oh, sorry, we've moved on from you, but we didn't. And we spent the time in the relationship, and we maintained it, and boom, next thing you know, that person's over at Target, and next thing you know, they're over at H&M or what have you. So I would just say, you learn so much through these. One thing I think Highwoods does kind of pride itself is finding the win-win. Win at all costs generally is not a long-term sustainable plan for creating value, and we want to take the long-term approach. And so we really value the concept of partnership. And yeah, I bet I could have 100 things that put everyone to sleep, but it's really cool is the people you get to meet, you get to work with to create value through the built environment, and then ideally change the world.
Wow. Last 3 questions for you, and these we can kind of hit together here. So what's the team focused on now? It's a very broad question, and then combine that without a forward-looking statement, I guess. Where do you see the future of the company? Is there any market? You have these 9 markets. Is there any market that you guys aren't in that you would like to be in? Asset class, I assume it's primarily going to be office, but is there any asset class or something kind of adjacent to that you guys aren't doing, or service? I know you have management too, but so those 2 questions. What are you guys focused on, and is there anything about the future that you guys haven't done, or personally?
Yeah, no, great. I mean, there's a lot in that question. So what are we focused on? Is sticking to our strategy, executing, being ready to go, being ready to grow. This is exactly why you go through the hard times, you go through the hard work and discipline of putting yourself in a position. That's what we're focused on. And executing on leasing, executing on filling our buildings up, outperforming the market. That's what keeps the lights on, right? So that's 100% what we're focused on, and focused on evolving, transforming from just a workplace company to a workplace experience company. So that's what we're focused on. Now, you mentioned the 9 markets. I would really argue that we have already kind of said we're more focused on the core set of Richmond, Raleigh, Charlotte, Atlanta, Tampa, Orlando, Nashville, and Dallas. We have announced we'll be cycling out of Pittsburgh over time. There's a few other investments we still have elsewhere, shows up in our our filings as other, which would include a building in Kansas City and some land elsewhere. We're focused on growth. There are other markets that would fit the same profiles of those I mentioned that we're always looking at, we're keeping an eye on. We don't feel the need to have to go anywhere else to effectuate our value proposition and our belief and our strategy. So I just would kind of throw that out there. But we're in the right places. We're, so many other times in other recessions in my career, and I would argue since the Industrial Revolution, when recessions occurred, activity and economic investment retreated to the gateway markets. The gateway markets being New York, Boston, LA, DC, Chicago, San Francisco. One could argue Seattle and Houston have kind of shown up there. And the idea of those gateway markets is those were the gateways to the American dream. Right. I'd get off a boat, I'm now here. And there's great value in someone getting off a boat to pursue the American dream. So this recession that we kind of all went through, this is the first time in my career, and I think anyone's career since the Industrial Revolution, where economic activity and investment retreated from the gateways.
Mm-hmm. Substantially.
Yes, substantially. And they retreated to where? These growth markets, the Sun Belt. Was it an anomaly? Why should a Wells Fargo building, why is 100,000 square feet of Wells Fargo occupancy in Charlotte worth half as much as 100,000 square foot of Wells Fargo occupancy in San Francisco? It shouldn't be. Rents can be more or less, but like you're talking about cap rates, and I think that was the big secret. It's like, wait a minute, core is core. Core is where real estate can outcompete. So I think the genie's out of the bottle for the Sunbelt markets. Big institutional investors who we didn't necessarily have to compete with have shown up, who are now, we run into them in the airport, big folks out of New York and California and Chicago. So I do think the world's changed in a very interesting, good way. Things have moved much faster. We're a smaller world, particularly here in the States, and our markets are going to benefit. What else did you ask me on that one?
Nope, that was it. Last one. Who do you think, and you've mentioned quite a few folks that you've kind of already praised in your appreciation along your way, but who else along the way in your career helped you the most, or did you learn a lot from? Who was significant in your development?
Well, I mean, I think it is a hope. I'm a product of so many great influences, and I'm so fortunate to continue to be the beneficiary of my partners here. Are my boss, Ted Klink, CEO, Brendan Mayrana, our CFO, Jeff Miller, our general counsel and secretary, Carmen Liuzzo, our head of investments. I mean, I've never been part of a core team like that, or head of development, Randy Robertson. It is so exceptional. But even it starts with my parents. My dad passed away a number of years ago, and he was retired colonel in the Air Force and a product of the Cold War. And we joked that my brothers and sisters moved as far away as they could, to California and places like that. And so it was a very kind of serious, disciplined upbringing. Well, my mom provided a little more of the light and some of it, but together, I think they had a tremendous impact. I lean into hard work. I feel like I'm sort of built for a crisis, built for pressure, built to kind of solve problems. I'm an eternal optimist. You can't tell me a glass is half empty ever. I would challenge everyone who's listening, surround yourself with optimistic people. Life is too short to surround yourself with those that aren't. And if you're having trouble doing that yourself, figure out how to change that. So I think kind of the mom and dad combo, yin and yang, definitely kind of influenced me. I had a fantastic advisor in grad school, a woman named Catherine Ross, who was a tenured professor primarily in transportation at Georgia Tech, who has her own firm. Her husband, Danny Boston, is a brilliant man, parents a wonderful family, and she she became my graduate advisor because I realized I had to learn location was the most valuable 3 words or most important words in real estate. But coming from D.C. to Atlanta, with D.C. having arguably worse traffic at the time when I went down there in the early 90s than Atlanta, you could, particularly the site of Atlantic Station that I was working on was basically an island. And island real estate is fantastic in the Caribbean, but not so good in the middle of Atlanta. And the problem was mobility. So my whole master's thesis of Atlantic Station was a multimodal transportation hub to solve the challenges of Atlanta's commute and congestion and sprawl. So I found in her someone who was primarily a transportation guru, but she understood that the important dynamic between land use and transportation. And she said, let's work together. And she believed in me. And she also had her own business. And so she had my back when I would go to professors on assignments, and I would go, all right, listen, I know what the assignment is, but if we could just take this approach, it would further support the research I'm doing on my master's thesis. It can help. And some of them wanted their way or the highway, and I respect that. But where I needed help, and she came off the top rope for me, and she's like, she made the point that those professors, that school is a business, and they need to serve their clients. And by the way, she told me, you're my client. And that made me feel fantastic. And so she and I, still dear family friends, such a class act, Catherine Ross, Charlie Brown, I mentioned Charlie Brown, total Princeton institution in Atlanta. Charlie taught me the value of a good story, right? Charlie always had a line. He'd say, why do dogs have so many friends? They wag their tails and not their tongues. And he had the way to tell a story to captivate someone. And I would argue, anyone in business, I don't care what you do, if you really want to create value for your enterprise and then yourself, you have to be in the sales and marketing side somehow. You have to convince someone to invest their time, their heart, and their money in you or your product or your place or your real estate. Otherwise, nothing happens. No transaction happens. So the closer you can get to that side of that business, the more value you create for your enterprise and for yourself. I saw Charlie do that through storytelling. So, and then I mentioned Todd Mansfield, who ran Crescent, and he taught me the power of excellence in terms of place. Right? AIG taught me the quality of excellence in performance. I remember it was harsh. I worked my tail off 70 hours a week for a full year, and whatever we were working on didn't necessarily hit a certain metric or what have you. And we basically got blanked for our bonuses, and the message was, great job. You get paid for performance, not for effort. It was like, touche. I get it. Yeah. So anyway, I don't know if I had last but not least, I'd be remiss. My hero, the person who blows me away every day, and I'm so glad she doesn't change the locks on me every time I leave, is my wife. And we've been through the GFC together. We've been through this pandemic together, my business, and changing companies and jobs. And I'm super fortunate that she's in real estate. She has that background. So when we travel as a family, we look at deals.
That's cool.
Kids have kind of gotten used to it. She's the best retail leasing person that I've ever worked with. And I'm really fortunate. So those are the folks that I'd say that are influencing me the most right now.
I love it. I think that's a good place to wrap. Brian, thanks for hosting. Thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was an honor. I got to tell you, best questions I've ever had. I mean, they were well thought out. You knew what you were talking about. And there's plenty of strings to pull for further conversation. So when you run out of your 1,000th person, I'd love to come back and catch up.
We'll do it again. Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, Matthew.